In November 1954, as the Cold War reordered empires and ideologies across the globe, a series of coordinated attacks across French Algeria ignited a conflict that would expose the fault lines of decolonization, fracture French society, and redefine the limits of Western power in the post-war world. Because the French war in Algeria was never merely a colonial rebellion, but a struggle over identity, legitimacy, and the meaning of sovereignty in an era when imperial control collided with the language of self-determination, and this collision was sharpened by Algeria's unique status within the French system, since unlike other colonies, it was legally integrated into France itself, divided into departments, and populated by nearly 1 million European settlers who viewed the land not as an overseas possession, but as an inseparable part of the nation. And this integration created a structural impossibility, because granting independence meant not simply withdrawing from a colony, but dismantling a core element of French national identity, a prospect many in Paris considered unthinkable, and for the indigenous Muslim majority, who endured political exclusion, economic inequality, and routine repression. This integration was a fiction that masked domination, making reform within the system appear increasingly futile. And it was within this context that the National Liberation Front, the FLN, emerged as a revolutionary movement determined to force the question of independence through armed struggle, calculating that only sustained violence could shatter the illusion that Algeria could remain French indefinitely. And the timing of the uprising reflected a global moment in which colonial rule was under unprecedented pressure, as independence movements across Asia and Africa drew inspiration from recent victories and from the weakening of European powers after World War II. Yet, Algeria differed because France was unwilling to frame the conflict as a colonial war at all, insisting instead that it was combating internal disorder and terrorism within its own territory, a stance that shaped every phase of the conflict. By denying the legitimacy of the opponent while justifying extraordinary measures in the name of internal security, and the opening attacks of November 1st, known as Toussaint Rouge, were militarily modest but politically explosive because they signaled a commitment to escalation and coordination that challenged French assumptions about the manageability of dissent. And the French response was swift and uncompromising, deploying troops, expanding police powers, and initiating a cycle of repression that would radicalize the conflict rather than contain it. And as the war unfolded, it became clear that the struggle would not be decided through conventional battles, but through control of populations, information, and fear, transforming Algeria into a laboratory of modern counterinsurgency, where techniques of surveillance, torture, and collective punishment were normalized in the pursuit of order. And this transformation mattered because it revealed how Cold War imperatives blurred moral boundaries. As France, a founding member of the Western Alliance, justified practices that contradicted the values it claimed to defend, arguing that the preservation of national unity required exceptional measures. And the Algerian War thus became a mirror in which France confronted its own contradictions, torn between republican ideals and imperial realities. And as violence escalated in both rural areas and cities, the conflict assumed a totalizing character, drawing civilians into its logic and erasing distinctions between battlefield and home. Because the FLN pursued a strategy of attrition and provocation, aiming to make Algeria ungovernable and to internationalize the conflict by forcing France into visible acts of repression. While the French military sought to crush the insurgency through overwhelming force and psychological domination, believing that decisive control could restore stability and deter further rebellion. And this belief was reinforced by the experience of recent wars, including Indochina, where defeat had been attributed by many officers not to the impossibility of empire, but to political hesitation, creating a determination within the army to avoid what they saw as civilian weakness. And this determination would have profound consequences because it shifted power toward the military and security services, undermining civilian authority and introducing a culture of emergency that would spill back into metropolitan France. And as the war deepened, the stakes expanded beyond Algeria itself, because the conflict became entangled with broader Cold War dynamics, as both sides sought international support and legitimacy, with the FLN presenting its struggle as part of a global anti-imperialist movement, aligned with non-alignment and revolutionary nationalism, while France framed the war as a bulwark against instability and communist influence in North Africa, even as the conflict's internal dynamics were driven less by ideology than by the structural violence of colonial rule. And within Algeria, the human cost mounted rapidly as villages were displaced, urban neighborhoods militarized, and torture became a routine instrument of interrogation, a practice that would later haunt French political life as revelations exposed the extent to which violence had been institutionalized. And yet, despite the scale of repression, the insurgency adapted and persisted, because the FLN's strength lay not in its firepower, but in its ability to embed itself within the population and to transform suffering into political capital, turning each act of repression into evidence that coexistence within the French system was impossible. And this dynamic created a vicious cycle in which violence generated more violence, hardening positions and narrowing the space for compromise. And as the conflict entered its early years, it became increasingly apparent that the question was no longer whether Algeria would be transformed, but how much destruction would accompany that transformation, and whether France could reconcile its desire to remain a global power with the realities of decolonization, a question that would reverberate through every institution of the French state, and ultimately force a reckoning that reshaped both Algeria and France in ways that extended far beyond the war's formal end. As the conflict escalated through the mid-1950s, the French war in Algeria evolved from a localized insurgency into a full-scale crisis that consumed the institutions of the French Republic, because the methods adopted to suppress rebellion fundamentally altered the balance between civilian authority and military power. And this alteration mattered not only for Algeria, but for France itself, as emergency rule and counterinsurgency doctrine reshaped governance on both sides of the Mediterranean. And in Algeria, the French army increasingly assumed operational control, expanding troop numbers dramatically and implementing strategies designed to sever the FLN from the population through forced relocations, mass arrests, and the creation of controlled zones that treated entire communities as suspect. And these measures reflected a belief that victory depended on total surveillance and coercion rather than political accommodation, a belief reinforced by the Army's reading of earlier defeats, particularly Indochina, where officers concluded that political hesitation had undermined military success, and this interpretation fueled a determination to impose order at any cost, even as the cost grew steadily higher, and as operations expanded, the war moved decisively into urban space. Most notably in Algiers, where the FLN launched a campaign of bombings and assassinations aimed at demonstrating its reach and provoking a harsh response that would expose the nature of French rule. And the French answer was the Battle of Algiers, a campaign that epitomized the logic of counterinsurgency through terror, as paratroopers were granted extraordinary powers to dismantle FLN networks using systematic torture, disappearances, and extrajudicial executions, practices that succeeded tactically in breaking the urban insurgency while inflicting lasting damage on France's moral and political foundations. And this contradiction between operational success and ethical collapse lay at the heart of the Algerian War. Because each short-term gain deepened the long-term crisis of legitimacy, both in Algeria and in metropolitan France, where revelations about torture and repression sparked bitter debates that fractured political parties, intellectual life, and public opinion. And yet these debates did not immediately translate into restraint, because the fear of losing Algeria outweighed concern over methods, reinforcing a culture in which ends justified means. And within Algeria, this culture manifested as a system of domination that penetrated daily life, as checkpoints, curfews, and collective punishment became routine, erasing any remaining distinction between civilian and combatant. And for the FLN, this environment validated its strategy, because repression confirmed the movement's claim that coexistence was impossible and that independence could only be achieved through total struggle, and the FLN responded by consolidating its organizational structure, imposing discipline through internal purges and expanding its diplomatic efforts abroad, seeking recognition and support from newly independent states and international forums, where the Algerian cause increasingly resonated as a symbol of anti-colonial resistance. And this internationalization mattered because it transformed the conflict from an internal French matter into a global issue that exposed the contradictions of Western liberalism during the Cold War, as France, a NATO ally, defended practices condemned elsewhere, while the FLN leveraged the language of self-determination to gain legitimacy despite its own use of violence against civilians. And as the war dragged on, the strain on French society intensified, because the massive mobilization of conscripts brought the conflict into millions of homes, exposing young men to brutal practices that many found morally corrosive, and returning veterans carried these experiences back to France, fueling disillusionment and opposition that challenged the authority of the Fourth Republic, whose chronic instability proved ill-suited to managing a protracted colonial war. And this instability culminated in a political crisis that threatened to spill into civil conflict, as sections of the military and settler population in Algeria lost faith in civilian leadership and began to contemplate direct intervention to preserve French rule, a development that underscored how the war had eroded constitutional norms and empowered actors willing to bypass democratic processes in the name of national survival. And it was within this atmosphere of polarization and impending breakdown that the Algerian War ceased to be merely a colonial conflict and became a decisive test of the French state itself, forcing a reckoning over whether France could remain both a republic committed to universal values and an imperial power reliant on systematic violence. A reckoning that would soon bring the conflict to the center of French political life and set the stage for dramatic transformations whose consequences would shape the Cold War landscape of Europe and North Africa alike. As the Algerian War entered its most dangerous phase in the late 1950s, the conflict crossed a threshold from colonial insurgency into a direct challenge to the authority and survival of the French state. Because the cumulative effects of prolonged violence, political paralysis, and military radicalization produced a crisis in which the army and European settler population in Algeria no longer trusted civilian leaders to defend what they regarded as the nation's core interests, and this breakdown reached its climax in May 1958, when demonstrations and insurrectionary actions in Algiers effectively paralyzed colonial administration and signaled the possibility of a military takeover, not aimed at overthrowing France, but at forcing Paris to abandon any thought of compromise. And this moment mattered profoundly, because it revealed how far the logic of emergency had penetrated French institutions, creating a situation in which constitutional authority appeared secondary to the perceived necessity of preserving Algeria as French. And under this pressure, the Fourth Republic collapsed. Its inability to reconcile colonial war with democratic governance laid bare. And into this vacuum stepped Charles de Gaulle, recalled to power as the only figure capable of restoring order and preventing civil war. And de Gaulle's return marked a turning point not only in French politics, but in the trajectory of the Algerian conflict. Because while many in the army and among settlers believed he would save French Algeria, de Gaulle himself understood that the war was unsustainable, both militarily and morally, and that France's future as a modern power depended on disentangling itself from a conflict that was corroding its institutions. And this divergence between expectation and intention would soon become explosive. And initially, de Gaulle moved cautiously, consolidating power through the establishment of the Fifth Republic, while maintaining ambiguity about Algeria's future, a strategy designed to stabilize the state and prevent immediate rebellion within the military. And during this period, French forces continued intensive operations against the FLN, achieving significant tactical successes through large-scale sweeps and border controls that disrupted insurgent supply lines. Yet these successes did not translate into political resolution because they addressed symptoms rather than causes, and de Gaulle increasingly framed the conflict not as a military problem to be solved, but as a political reality to be confronted, culminating in his gradual acceptance of Algerian self-determination, a position that shattered the assumptions of those who had supported his return. And this shift exposed the depth of the war's polarization, because for European settlers and segments of the army, any move toward independence was experienced as betrayal, a negation of sacrifice, and an abandonment of those who had committed themselves to a vision of Algeria as inseparable from France. And this sense of betrayal fueled radicalization, giving rise to conspiratorial networks, and ultimately to the formation of the Organisation de l'Armée Secrète, the OAS, which launched a campaign of terror aimed at derailing negotiations and punishing both Algerians and French officials deemed insufficiently committed to French Algeria, and this internal violence underscored how the war had metastasized, no longer confined to a struggle between colonizer and colonized, but spilling into intra-French conflict that threatened to tear the state apart. And for the FLN, these developments reinforced the conviction that independence was within reach, as the French political system fractured under the strain, and the movement intensified its diplomatic efforts, leveraging international opinion and the shifting global climate of decolonization to isolate France. And by the early 1960s, negotiations became unavoidable as de Gaulle pursued a settlement that would end the war even at the cost of internal dissent. And this pursuit revealed the ultimate limits of counterinsurgency, because despite years of repression and tactical victories, the fundamental question of legitimacy remained unresolved, and no amount of force could reconcile a population determined to govern itself with a system built on exclusion and coercion. And when the Evian Accords were signed in 1962, formally ending the war and granting Algeria independence, they marked not only the conclusion of a brutal conflict, but the collapse of a worldview that had sustained French empire. And yet the end of fighting did not bring immediate peace, because the legacy of violence, displacement, and mutual distrust continued to shape Algeria's internal struggles and France's political life, leaving scars that extended far beyond the formal end of hostilities. And in this sense, the French war in Algeria stands as one of the Cold War's most revealing conflicts, because it demonstrates how decolonization, could destabilize even established democracies, exposing the fragility of institutions under the pressure of imperial retreat, and how the Cold War's language of order and security could justify practices that undermined the very values they claimed to defend, turning a war for control into a crisis of identity whose consequences reshaped both the colonizer and the colonized in lasting and irreversible ways. As independence approached and the French war in Algeria entered its final, most violent chapter, the conflict revealed how endings shaped by exhaustion rather than reconciliation can unleash new forms of destruction, because the gradual acceptance of Algerian self-determination did not bring immediate de-escalation, but instead intensified violence as competing actors sought to shape the outcome through terror, retaliation, and mass flight. And this phase mattered because it demonstrated that the collapse of colonial authority created a vacuum in which old hierarchies dissolved faster than new political orders could take shape. And within this vacuum, fear became the dominant force, driving decisions that would leave enduring scars on Algerian society and on France's collective memory. And for the European settler population, the Pieds Noirs, de Gaulle's turn toward independence was experienced as an existential shock, shattering the assumption that France would protect them indefinitely and transforming neighbors into enemies almost overnight. And this fear fueled a desperate campaign by the OAS, whose bombings and assassinations targeted not only the FLN, but French officials, intellectuals, and civilians, aiming to render Algeria ungovernable and force Paris to reverse course. And this campaign reflected the war's ultimate moral collapse, because it showed how a struggle framed as the defense of civilization had degenerated into indiscriminate violence that mirrored the practices it once condemned. And within Algerian society, the impending end of French rule triggered its own wave of reckoning as rival factions within the nationalist movement maneuvered for power, settling scores and asserting dominance in anticipation of independence, revealing that unity forged under occupation did not guarantee harmony once the common enemy withdrew. And this internal tension was compounded by the fate of the Harkis, Algerian Muslims who had fought alongside French forces, whose vulnerability exposed the war's cruelest paradox because they were abandoned by the state they had served and targeted by those who viewed collaboration as unforgivable, leading to massacres that underscored how decolonization could produce new victims even as it ended formal domination. And France's failure to protect or evacuate many of these auxiliaries became one of the war's most enduring moral indictments, highlighting how political expediency often trumped responsibility in moments of transition. And as violence spiraled, the exodus of the Pieds Noirs accelerated, with hundreds of thousands fleeing to France in a matter of months, carrying with them trauma, resentment, and a sense of betrayal that would shape French politics for decades. And this mass displacement transformed metropolitan France, forcing a society already divided by the war to confront the human consequences of imperial collapse. And yet, even amid this chaos, the Evian Accords went into effect, formalizing independence and ending French military operations, marking a legal conclusion that contrasted sharply with the lived reality of fear and upheaval on the ground. And in Algeria, independence arrived burdened by the legacy of a war that had normalized violence, eroded trust, and devastated social structures, creating a state born not from negotiated coexistence, but from prolonged struggle and suffering. And this origin shaped the post-colonial trajectory as the FLN consolidated power by invoking its role as the sole legitimate representative of the liberation struggle, marginalizing rivals and embedding authoritarian tendencies justified by the memory of war. And for France, the end of the conflict forced a reckoning with the methods employed in Algeria, as revelations about torture, disappearances, and collective punishment challenged the self-image of a republic committed to human rights, exposing how Cold War imperatives and imperial anxieties had led to practices that contradicted foundational values. And this reckoning was uneven and contested, producing silence alongside acknowledgement, denial alongside reflection, and leaving the war's moral questions unresolved within public discourse. And in this sense, the French War in Algeria did not truly end in 1962, but continued to reverberate through politics, memory, and identity on both sides of the Mediterranean, standing as a stark example of how decolonization during the Cold War could dismantle empires while destabilizing democracies, and how the struggle to preserve control could ultimately destroy the legitimacy it sought to defend, turning a war fought to maintain unity into a catalyst for transformation whose consequences reshaped nations long after the last shots were fired. As the immediate violence of the war subsided, and Algeria entered the uncertain early years of independence, the deeper consequences of the conflict became impossible to ignore, because the French War in Algeria had not only determined sovereignty, but had reordered social structures, political expectations, and collective memory in ways that would define both Algeria and France for generations. And this mattered because the war's legacy was not confined to its battlefield outcomes, but embedded itself in institutions and identities forged under extreme pressure. And in Algeria, the FLN's victory carried an inherent contradiction. As a movement that had mobilized mass support through resistance now faced the task of governing a fractured society shaped by trauma, displacement, and internal rivalries. And the legitimacy derived from armed struggle became the foundation of political authority, discouraging pluralism and framing dissent as betrayal of the revolution, a pattern that reflected how wars of liberation often convert military cohesion into political dominance. And this conversion shaped the Algerian state as power consolidated around those who claimed proximity to the struggle, marginalizing alternative visions and embedding authoritarian tendencies justified by the memory of sacrifice. And this outcome illustrates how decolonization could reproduce forms of coercion, even as it dismantled colonial rule, revealing the difficulty of translating revolutionary legitimacy into inclusive governance. And for France, the war's aftermath produced a parallel reckoning, because the conflict forced the Republic to confront the contradiction between its universalist ideals and the violence used to preserve empire. And while the establishment of the Fifth Republic stabilized political institutions, it did so by centralizing executive power, a change influenced in part by the perceived failures of parliamentary governance during the war. And this institutional shift reshaped French politics, strengthening the presidency while leaving unresolved debates about accountability, emergency, powers, and the role of the military. And socially, the war left deep scars as veterans struggled to reconcile their experiences with civilian life, and as immigrant communities from Algeria navigated a society still divided over the conflict, carrying memories that were often suppressed or denied. And this suppression mattered because silence became a way of postponing moral reckoning, allowing myths of necessity and denial to coexist with emerging evidence of torture and repression. And over time, these unresolved tensions resurfaced through legal cases, historical research, and cultural representation, reopening debates about responsibility and memory that revealed how incomplete the process of coming to terms with the war had been. And internationally, the Algerian War contributed to a broader shift in the Cold War landscape. because it accelerated the collapse of European empires and strengthened the legitimacy of anti-colonial movements, demonstrating that sustained resistance could overcome even militarily superior powers, and this lesson resonated across Africa and beyond, shaping revolutionary strategies and Western anxieties alike, as states confronted the limits of force in maintaining control over unwilling populations. And in this sense, the Algerian conflict stands as a pivotal Cold War episode, not because it altered the balance of superpower rivalry directly, but because it exposed how global ideological competition intersected with the structural violence of empire, creating conflicts that destabilized both colonizer and colonized. And as historians continue to examine the war, it becomes clear that its significance lies in this intersection, where decolonization, counterinsurgency, and Cold War logic converged to produce a conflict that reshaped political norms and moral boundaries. And the French War in Algeria thus serves as a stark reminder that the Cold War was not only fought through proxy wars and nuclear standoffs, but through struggles over legitimacy and identity that unfolded within empires, collapsing under their own contradictions, leaving behind states transformed by violence and memories that continue to challenge simple narratives of progress or victory. In closing, the French War in Algeria stands as one of the Cold War's most profound and destabilizing conflicts, because it revealed how decolonization could fracture not only empires, but the moral and institutional foundations of the states that sought to preserve them. And what makes this war so consequential is that it was fought simultaneously on multiple levels, as an insurgency in Algeria, a political crisis in France, and a symbolic struggle within the global Cold War over legitimacy, sovereignty, and the meaning of self-determination. And in each of these arenas, the conflict exposed the limits of force as a tool of control, because despite overwhelming military power and tactical success, France was unable to reconcile domination with consent. Nor could it suppress a population whose demand for independence had become inseparable from identity itself. And this failure mattered because it demonstrated that the Cold War's emphasis on order and stability often obscured deeper structural injustices, allowing democracies to justify repression in the name of security while eroding the very principles they claimed to defend. And in Algeria, the victory of independence came at an enormous cost, leaving behind a society shaped by trauma, displacement, and the legacy of revolutionary violence. Where political authority was rooted in the memory of war and dissent, could be framed as betrayal of sacrifice, embedding patterns that would shape governance long after colonial rule ended. And for France, the war forced a painful reckoning with empire, accelerating the collapse of imperial ambition while transforming domestic politics through the creation of a stronger executive state, a change born not from confidence but from crisis. And this transformation underscored how colonial wars could rebound inward, destabilizing metropolitan institutions and reshaping national identity in ways that outlasted the conflict itself. And internationally, the Algerian War became a reference point for anti-colonial movements and Western strategists alike, illustrating both the power of sustained resistance and the moral hazards of counterinsurgency, influencing debates about intervention, legitimacy, and human rights throughout the remainder of the Cold War. And in this sense, the war's significance lies not only in its outcome, but in what it revealed about the era, that the Cold War was not solely a contest between superpowers, but a series of interconnected struggles over who had the right to rule, whose violence would be justified, and whose suffering would be ignored. And the French War in Algeria exposed these questions with unusual clarity, because it forced a democratic state to confront the contradiction between universal ideals and imperial practice, and forced a colonized population to endure liberation through prolonged and devastating conflict, leaving behind memories that resisted closure. And as history continues to revisit this war, its lessons remain unsettled, reminding us that decolonization achieved through force carries consequences that extend far beyond independence, and that the Cold War's promise of order often came at the price of legitimacy, ensuring that some of its most enduring battles were fought not on nuclear frontiers, but within societies struggling to reconcile power with justice. As the long shadow of the French War in Algeria extended into the later decades of the Cold War, the conflict increasingly came to be understood as a defining example of how imperial collapse reshaped global politics from the inside out, because it demonstrated that the most destabilizing consequences of decolonization were often felt not at the margins of empire, but at its center, where political systems, moral frameworks, and national identities were forced into crisis by the attempt to maintain control through force. And this mattered because it revealed that the Cold War's emphasis on stability frequently masked profound internal fractures within Western states, fractures exposed when colonial subjects refused to accept the structures that bound them. And in France, the war's legacy continued to surface through delayed acknowledgement, legal battles, and public debate, as successive generations grappled with the reality that practices once justified as necessary had violated the principles that defined the Republic, creating a slow and uneven process of reckoning that underscored how difficult it is for societies to confront violence committed in their name. And this difficulty was mirrored in Algeria, where the memory of the war remained foundational yet contested, invoked to legitimize authority while leaving unresolved questions about inclusion, accountability, and the limits of revolutionary legitimacy, demonstrating how liberation struggles can harden into political orthodoxy that resists reform even as it preserves sovereignty. And from a broader Cold War perspective, the Algerian conflict challenged simplistic narratives of East versus West by revealing how power operated through empire, counterinsurgency, and repression as much as through ideological rivalry, showing that Western democracies were capable of sustained coercion when confronted with challenges to their authority, a reality that complicated claims of moral superiority in the global competition for influence. And this complication resonated across the decolonizing world, where the Algerian experience became both inspiration and warning, illustrating the potential of mass mobilization to defeat imperial rule, while also highlighting the costs of prolonged violence for post-colonial state building. And in this sense, the war's significance lies in its exposure of the Cold War's deeper contradictions, because it showed how the language of freedom and security could be used simultaneously to justify domination and resistance, blurring moral boundaries and leaving legacies that outlasted the conflict itself. And as historians continue to situate the Algerian War within the wider Cold War landscape, it emerges not as an isolated colonial episode, but as a central case study in how global ideological struggle intersected with the dismantling of empire, producing conflicts that reshaped nations internally, even as they altered international alignments. And this recognition reinforces a final, sobering insight that the Cold War's most transformative battles were often fought not between superpowers, but within societies struggling to reconcile power, identity, and legitimacy under the pressure of a world order in transition, making the French War in Algeria a crucial lens through which to understand the enduring consequences of decolonization in an age defined by ideological confrontation and contested sovereignty. As the Cold War moved toward its final decades, the French War in Algeria increasingly stood as a reference point for policymakers, military theorists, and intellectuals seeking to understand the limits of power in an era defined by ideological confrontation and declining empires, because the conflict demonstrated with brutal clarity that control achieved through coercion could not substitute for legitimacy, and that even overwhelming force could fail when deployed against a population whose political demands were rooted in identity and historical grievance. And this lesson mattered because it challenged assumptions that stability could be engineered indefinitely through security measures alone, an assumption that had underpinned much Cold War strategy in both colonial and post-colonial contexts. And for France, the war's enduring presence in public debate revealed how deeply it had reshaped national consciousness as questions of torture, repression, and responsibility continued to unsettle the Republic's self-image, forcing periodic confrontations with a past that resisted closure. And these confrontations highlighted the difficulty of reconciling democratic ideals with the realities of counterinsurgency, particularly when fear and prestige are invoked to justify extraordinary measures. And in Algeria, the memory of the war remained inseparable from the legitimacy of the state, shaping political discourse through an emphasis on sacrifice and unity that left limited space for pluralism, illustrating how wars of liberation can generate both sovereignty and constraint, empowering nations while narrowing the range of acceptable dissent. And this dual legacy underscores the complexity of decolonization as a Cold War process, because it did not simply transfer power from empire to nation, but reconfigured the relationship between violence, authority, and memory in ways that continue to influence political life. And, internationally, the Algerian conflict informed debates about insurgency and counterinsurgency throughout the latter half of the 20th century, serving as both a warning and a template, cited by those who sought to justify harsh methods, and by those who argued that such methods ultimately undermined political objectives. And this contested interpretation reflects the war's unresolved moral status, suspended between narratives of necessity and condemnation. And in this sense, the French War in Algeria remains one of the Cold War's most instructive episodes, because it reveals how deeply the struggle over legitimacy penetrated societies on all sides of the conflict, and how the refusal to address that struggle directly prolonged violence and magnified its consequences. And as the Cold War receded into history, the Algerian War continued to speak across time as a reminder that decolonization achieved through repression leaves behind not only independent states, but unsettled questions that outlast formal endings, shaping politics, identity, and memory long after sovereignty is secured, and demonstrating that the Cold War's legacy is measured not only in alliances and borders, but in the enduring effort to reconcile power with justice in a world transformed by the collapse of empire. As the historical distance from the French War in Algeria has grown, the conflict has increasingly been recognized as a turning point that exposed the structural limits of imperial power during the Cold War, because it showed that even a modern, industrialized democracy could be destabilized by the attempt to deny political legitimacy to a majority population over an extended period. And this recognition matters because it reframes the war not as an aberration, but as a warning about the costs of conflating security with domination, a conflation that lay at the heart of many Cold War conflicts, where order was prioritized over consent. And in France, this understanding has driven a slow reevaluation of the war's place in national history as official acknowledgement of torture, repression, and state responsibility has emerged unevenly, reflecting ongoing discomfort with confronting a past that challenges foundational myths of Republican virtue. And this uneven reckoning illustrates how states struggle to integrate colonial violence into democratic narratives, often oscillating between denial and partial recognition rather than full accountability. And in Algeria, the war's legacy continues to shape political legitimacy, as the memory of liberation remains central to state identity, while simultaneously constraining political evolution by elevating revolutionary credentials above institutional accountability. A dynamic that reveals how liberation can harden into a governing doctrine that resists change. And from a broader Cold War perspective, the Algerian conflict underscores how decolonization functioned as a parallel arena of ideological struggle, where claims of freedom, security, and progress were contested not between superpowers alone, but between states and subject populations, producing outcomes that reshaped global norms around sovereignty and intervention. And this reshaping influenced international law, human rights discourse, and the expectations placed on states confronting internal insurgency, even as practice often lagged behind principle. And the Algerian War's influence can be traced through later conflicts where counterinsurgency doctrine, population control, and emergency powers were justified through lessons drawn selectively from its experience, highlighting how unresolved moral questions can be repurposed rather than resolved. And in this sense, the war's enduring relevance lies in its capacity to illuminate the long-term consequences of refusing political solutions to fundamentally political problems, because it demonstrates that repression can delay change but rarely prevents it, instead magnifying the eventual cost. And as historians continue to situate the conflict within the Cold War's global framework, the French War in Algeria stands out as a case where the collapse of empire forced a reckoning that extended far beyond the battlefield, reshaping institutions, identities, and international perceptions in ways that could not be undone by independence alone. And this recognition reinforces a final insight that the Cold War's most transformative struggles were often those in which power confronted legitimacy directly, and where the attempt to preserve control through force ultimately accelerated the very transformations it sought to prevent, leaving behind societies permanently marked by the tension between authority and justice. In closing, the French War in Algeria stands as one of the Cold War's most consequential confrontations, because it exposed, with exceptional clarity, the point at which imperial power, democratic ideals, and global ideological rivalry collided and could no longer coexist. And what makes this conflict so enduring is not only its brutality, but the way it revealed that legitimacy, once withdrawn by a population, cannot be restored through force without destroying the institutions that wield it. And this truth unfolded relentlessly across 8 years of violence, in which tactical success repeatedly failed to translate into political resolution, undermining the very authority it sought to defend. And for France, the war marked the end of empire as a viable foundation for national identity, forcing a painful redefinition of power that reshaped political institutions, civil-military relations, and the boundaries of state authority, while leaving behind unresolved moral questions about torture, repression, and responsibility that continue to surface long after the guns fell silent. And for Algeria, independence arrived inseparable from the scars of prolonged struggle, embedding the memory of war into the structure of the state itself, where liberation became both a source of legitimacy and a constraint on political pluralism, demonstrating how freedom achieved through violence can carry forward the habits of coercion even as it dismantles foreign rule. And within the broader Cold War, the Algerian conflict shattered the illusion that ideological alignment guaranteed moral coherence, revealing how Western democracies could adopt authoritarian methods when confronted with challenges to sovereignty, complicating claims of moral superiority and reshaping global debates over intervention, counterinsurgency, and human rights. And this complication mattered because it influenced how future conflicts were framed and justified, allowing the language of security to obscure structural injustice while postponing ethical reckoning. And in this sense, the French war in Algeria was not an anomaly, but a warning showing how the refusal to address political demands directly can transform a crisis of governance into a war that destabilizes both ruler and ruled. And as history continues to assess the Cold War, the Algerian War remains a central case study in how decolonization forced empires to confront their own contradictions, revealing that power exercised without consent ultimately corrodes itself, leaving behind nations reshaped not only by independence, but by the long struggle to reconcile authority with justice. And it is this unresolved tension, born in the forests, cities, and prisons of Algeria, that ensures the war's relevance endures as one of the Cold War's defining and most unsettling legacies.